She was found beneath the altar, and no one saw it coming. How could the man everyone trusted with their souls hide a darkness so deadly? Tonight we uncover the secrets, the lies, and the forbidden desires that shattered a life, and the shocking truth waiting in the shadows will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about faith. Sunday mornings always sounded the same in Grace Hollow. Bells rang soft and slow. Wooden doors creaked open, and people stepped inside the church carrying their private fears like folded prayers. At the center of it all stood Pastor Elias Moore, tall, calm, his voice warm enough to make even doubt feel sinful. He spoke about temptation that morning, about how the devil disguised himself as comfort. The congregation listened, heads bowed, hands clasped. Elias had a gift for making people feel seen without ever truly seeing them. His sermons wrapped scripture around emotion, binding truth and control so tightly that few could tell the difference. In the third row from back sat a woman who hadn't been there long. Rachel Collins kept her eyes fixed on the pulpit, blinking back tears. To anyone else, she looked like another lost soul seeking guidance. To Elias, she was already more than that. He knew the way her hands trembled when she prayed. He knew her story, because he had asked for it behind closed doors. The narration shifts quietly, peeling back the polished surface. Late evenings in the pastor's office. Counseling sessions that lasted too long. Words spoken gently, then personally. Elias told himself he was helping her heal. That was the lie he repeated until it sounded like faith. Rachel remembered the first time he told her God had sent her to him. The way his hand rested on her shoulder, just a moment longer than necessary. The way silence filled the room after prayer, heavy and expectant. She had mistaken that silence for safety. Elias continued preaching. His eyes briefly met hers. Just a second. Long enough for Rachel's chest to tighten. The sermon shifted toward forgiveness, toward secrets that could destroy lives if dragged into the light. Some in the pews nodded, unaware they were listening to a confession disguised as wisdom. There were whispers even then, unspoken doubts that drifted through Grace Hollow like wind through old trees. People trusted Elias because they needed to. Faith was easier when someone else carried the answers. No one noticed how often Rachel stayed behind, or how often Elias watched the doors lock. In the front row, Elias's wife Margaret sat perfectly still. She had learned over the years how to read her husband's pauses, his careful breathing between verses. Something was off. She couldn't name it, but she felt it like a crack beneath polished stone. The service ended with prayer and polite smiles. People lined up to shake the pastor's hand, thanking him for words they believed were meant for them alone. Rachel waited until the church emptied. Elias told her softly to meet him later, his tone calm, practiced, unquestioned. That night, as darkness settled over Grace Hollow, Elias sat alone in his study. The house was quiet. Margaret slept upstairs. Scripture lay open on his desk, untouched. His phone buzzed once. He ignored it. It buzzed again. The message came from a number he knew by heart. "You said God would protect us." It read, "You promised me you wouldn't leave." Elias stared at the screen, his reflection fractured in the glass as the weight of his secret finally began to press back. Outside, the church bell rang once, echoing like a warning to night. The message from the night before still echoed in Elias Moore's mind as Sunday faded into memory. By Monday evening, Rachel Collins returned to the church, sitting again in the third row, hands folded so tightly her knuckles ached. She had barely slept. Neither had he. The silence between sermons felt louder than any confession. Rachel had not planned on staying after service when she first came to Grace Hollow. She had been new, freshly divorced, hollowed out by years of quiet disappointment. The church promised peace. Elias promised understanding. That was how it began, with conversations framed as guidance, never desire. He invited her into his office during her second week. Door remained open at first. He asked about her childhood, her marriage, her fears. He listened with practiced empathy, nodding slowly, eyes soft. When she cried, he handed her tissues and quoted scripture about endurance and trials. Rachel felt chosen, noticed in a way she hadn't felt in years. The sessions grew longer. The door eventually closed. Elias spoke of God's plan, of burdens meant to be shared. He told her pain could draw people closer to faith, closer to each other. His words blurred boundaries, wrapping authority around intimacy until Rachel could no longer separate the two. She told herself this was what healing looked like. When his hand brushed hers during prayer, she felt guilty for noticing. When his voice softened, she leaned in without realizing. Elias never rushed her. He knew patience was power. Outside the office, Grace Hollow remained unaware. Parishioner smiled at Rachel, assuming she was another soul saved by faith. No one asked why she lingered late or why her eyes followed the pastor everywhere. Secrets were safest when disguised as devotion. Rachel began structuring her days around his calls. If he texted, her heart raced. If hours passed without a message, panic crept in. Elias noticed the shift and fed it carefully, reminding her how fragile trust could be if mishandled. He warned her about gossip, about temptation, about the danger of misunderstanding their bond. Sometimes he spoke about his own loneliness, carefully measured confessions designed to mirror hers. He told her leadership was isolating, that even marriage could feel like a duty rather than comfort. Rachel listened, believing she was being trusted with something sacred, something fragile. At home, Rachel stared at her phone more than her reflection. She ignored friends who asked why she seemed distant. She believed Elias when he said people wouldn't understand what God was doing. Doubt, he told her, was the devil's favorite tool. One evening, after another prayer session stretched deep into night, Rachel finally spoke what had been building inside her. Her voice shook as she admitted her feelings, apologizing through tears, begging forgiveness for emotions she believed were sinful. Elias did not quote scripture this time. He stood, closed the office door, and told her feelings were not sins if they came from a place of love. He said God tested even his strongest servants. Rachel felt relief flood her chest, mistaking permission for compassion. Her heart pounded, not with fear yet, but with a dangerous hope that this moment meant she was finally seen, chosen, and protected, unaware that devotion was quietly transforming into something far darker than she could imagine. As he reached for her hand, the church stood silent around them. Somewhere in the building, a light flickered off. Outside, night settled thick and heavy. Rachel did not notice the lock click into place. She only noticed that, for the first time, the pastor did not let go. The click of the lock echoed louder than Rachel expected. It was a small sound, almost insignificant, yet it marked a point of no return. The office felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in as Elias kept hold of her hand. His grip was firm, reassuring in a way that frightened her only later. He told her to sit. His voice was calm, measured, the same voice that guided hundreds every Sunday. He spoke of prayer, of confusion, of how even shepherds could stumble. Rachel listened, nodding, desperate to believe there was still holiness in the room. When he prayed aloud, asking God for silence and discretion, she mistook control for care. What followed was never spoken about directly. It lived instead in fragments, the smell of old books, the hum of the heater, the way Elias avoided her eyes afterward. Rachel left that night shaken, convinced she had crossed a sacred line willingly. Elias stayed behind, washing his hands in the small sink, whispering forgiveness to himself. Days passed, then weeks. The secret took root. Their meetings became routine, disguised as counseling, masked as spiritual urgency. Elias controlled the timing, the setting. Rules Rachel learned to obey without being asked. He told her secrecy was protection, that scandal would destroy not just him, but the church, her soul, everything she still hoped to save. She clung to his words when guilt clawed at her chest. When doubt surfaced, Elias reminded her how much she needed him. He framed his authority as sacrifice, his sin as burden. Rachel absorbed the blame easily. She had been trained to. At night, she prayed alone, asking God why he felt so distant. There was no answer. Silence stretched on, thick and unmoving. In that quiet, Elias's voice filled the space faith once occupied. He began to dictate how she dressed, who she spoke to, when she could come by. He warned her about emotional weakness, about women who destroyed good men by misunderstanding attention. Rachel listened, terrified of becoming that woman. Love, she believed, required obedience. Sometimes Elias pulled away suddenly, cold and distant, reminding her of boundaries only he could define. The withdrawal hurt more than the closeness. Rachel learned quickly that compliance brought warmth, while resistance brought scripture sharpened into threat. At home, she stared at her reflection, searching for the person she used to be. Friends noticed her weight loss, the way her laughter faded. She told them she was finding faith. They believed her. Everyone believed him. Elias preached louder now. His sermons grew harsher, focused on temptation and moral decay. Congregation applauded his passion, unaware it was fueled by fear. Each men felt like a lie that demanded another. Rachel started keeping track of days for reasons she didn't yet understand. Her body felt different, unfamiliar. Nausea crept into mornings. Fatigue wrapped around her like fog. She told herself it was stress, guilt manifesting physically. When she finally realized the truth, she sat on the bathroom floor long after the test slipped from her shaking fingers. The room spun as she stared at the result. 2 lines, clear, unforgiving. Her first instinct was prayer. Her second was panic. Elias answered her call that night, his voice sharp with irritation until she spoke. When she told him, silence filled the line, not the holy silence he once promised, but something colder, calculating. He told her not to tell anyone. He told her to come see him the next evening. He said they would handle it. Rachel pressed her hand to her stomach, tears blurring her vision, realizing too late that God had been silent for a long time. And now, the man who claimed to speak for him was not. The church office smelled of old paper and dust when Rachel arrived the next evening. Elias sat behind his desk, Bible open, expression composed. He did not ask how she felt. He asked if she had prayed, as though obedience mattered more than fear tonight inside those silent walls again. Rachel told him about the test, her hands shaking as she spoke. Elias closed the Bible slowly, as if sealing judgment inside its pages. He said children were blessings, then immediately spoke of ruin, reputation, and God's work collapsing overnight for everyone involved, especially her. He warned quietly, then paused. He paced while talking, scripture flowing easily, practiced sharp. Every verse bent toward one conclusion, silence. He framed fear as wisdom, control as love. Rachel felt her chest tighten as responsibility shifted entirely onto her trembling shoulders under divine instruction. He insisted, softly, firmly, without room for refusal or mercy. Elias told her abortion was not sin when survival was at stake. He said God forgave necessary sacrifices. He reminded her who would be destroyed if truth surfaced, the church, his wife, Rachel herself. He never mentioned love again, only duty, secrecy, and obedience to divine order, he repeated coldly. Rachel tried to speak, but guilt flooded her faster than words. Elias interrupted gently, placing a hand over hers, lowering his voice. He said emotions clouded judgment. He said she needed guidance now more than ever, especially from someone chosen by God to lead, protect, and decide for her future. He gave her time to cry. Counting minutes in silence, when she looked up, he outlined a plan already decided, an appointment, a ride, discretion. Rachel nodded automatically, numb, realizing the decision had been made long before she entered the room without her consent, cloaked in prayer, fear, and authority. That night, Rachel went home hollow. She stared at the ceiling, replaying his words until they sounded like scripture. Sleep refused her. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the life growing inside her, already treated as sin needing erasure, silence, sacrifice, and forgiveness. She never asked once. Elias watched her leave through the window, jaw tight. He told himself he was protecting everyone. Margaret sat upstairs reading, unaware her marriage had already shifted into something unrecognizable. Elias prayed briefly, not for forgiveness, but for control over what came next, and silence from God, church, and conscience alike. Over the following days, Rachel felt watched by her own fear. Elias checked constantly, reminding her of schedules and secrecy. His kindness felt conditional now. When she hesitated, he warned her gently that chaos followed disobedience, especially for women. Already judged harshly by society, church, family, and God, he implied. Something hardened inside Rachel. She began writing things down, dates, phrases, feelings, not evidence, she told herself, just clarity. At night, she whispered apologies to her stomach, promising she would find a way to survive what followed, whatever Elias decided, demanded, or threatened her with, using faith as weapon again. She returned to the church earlier than planned one afternoon, heart racing. The office door was unlocked. Elias was not there. On the desk lay his phone, screen glowing with messages. One notification caught her breath before she could stop herself from reading the name displayed clearly on top line. The name was Margaret, the message short, sharp, suspicious. Rachel felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She realized then she was not the only woman being deceived by Scripture, and silence. The truth was larger, messier, and far more dangerous than confession, forgiveness, or prayer could contain any more now. Rachel stepped back, pulse pounding, knowing confrontation was inevitable. Elias had promised protection, but delivered fear instead. As she left the office, she decided silence would no longer save her. What she did next would change everything forever, even if it meant challenging a man everyone trusted, feared, and followed. Margaret Moore had spent years learning how to notice what her husband never said. Marriage to a pastor demanded silence, patience, and the ability to ignore small fractures before they widened into questions no one wanted answered. Lately, those fractures had begun to show everywhere. It started with Elias coming home later than usual. Meetings that once ended before sunset now stretched deep into night. When Margaret asked, he offered explanations polished and effortless, like sermons delivered on instinct, counseling emergencies, lost souls. God's work never rested, he reminded her gently. Margaret nodded, as she always had, but something felt wrong. She noticed how Elias guarded his phone now, angling the screen away from her, silencing notifications with reflexive precision. At night, he turned his back to her in bed, shoulders tense, breathing shallow. Prayer between them had grown shorter, colder, like ritual without meaning. On Sunday mornings, Margaret watched him from the front pew. She knew his rhythms. The pauses where emphasis lived. His sermons had changed. There was urgency in his voice now, sharpness where compassion once softened his words. He spoke often of temptation, of women who misled righteous men, of secrets capable of destroying entire communities. The congregation listened. Margaret listened harder. She noticed the woman in the third row, the same one who always stayed late. Rachel Collins, quiet, pale, too attentive. Margaret told herself she was imagining things, but her eyes kept drifting back, catching the way Rachel flinched whenever Elias raised his voice, the way she avoided Margaret's gaze entirely. One afternoon, Margaret decided to clean Elias's car. It was something she did when her thoughts felt too loud. In the back seat, tucked beneath old sermon notes, she found a scarf she did not recognize, soft fabric, dark color, a faint rust-colored stain near one edge. Her hands trembled as she held it. That evening, Elias arrived home distracted, distant. Margaret placed the scarf on the kitchen table without a word. Elias froze, just for a moment, long enough. He laughed it off, said it must belong to someone from the church. Margaret watched him carefully, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes avoided hers. She did not press further. She had learned long ago that truth revealed itself faster when not chased. That night, Margaret lay awake, listening to Elias breathe beside her. She thought about faith, about how easily belief could blind even the most devout. She wondered how many things she had chosen not to see over the years because seeing required action. The next morning, she noticed Elias leave without his wedding ring. Margaret sat alone in the quiet house, the weight of suspicion pressing against her chest. She thought of vows spoken before God, of trust demanded by position and reinforced by fear of scandal. She thought of the church, of how easily it protected men who spoke well and prayed loudly. She decided then to start watching, not accusing, listening, not confronting. Answers came faster that way. Across town, Rachel sat in her apartment, staring at her phone, heart pounding. She replayed Elias's warnings, his promises, his threats. Margaret's name echoed in her mind like a ticking clock. Rachel typed a message, erased it, typed again. Her hands shook as she stared at the screen, knowing once words were sent, silence would never be an option again. At the same time, Margaret stood in the doorway of Elias's study, noticing something else missing now. His second phone, the one he never used around her. Two women, separated by truth and lies, were beginning to notice the same thing, and neither of them understood yet how dangerous noticing could be. Rachel arrived at the church after dusk, the parking lot empty and slick with rain. Inside, the lights were dimmed, shadows stretching along the hallway as if listening. Elias waited in the office, hands folded, face composed into prayer before she spoke. He asked her to sit, to breathe, to trust. He said fear came from the enemy, not from God. Rachel told him she could not do what he demanded. The word abortion caught in her throat, heavy and final. Elias closed his eyes, bowed his head, and began to pray aloud. His prayer sounded gentle, practiced, merciful. He thanked God for authority, for order, for removing obstacles that threatened his work. Rachel listened, realizing the words were not meant for heaven but for her. When he finished, he looked up and smiled as though blessing had been granted. He told her refusal would force consequences. He spoke of scandal, of courts, of people who would never believe a troubled woman over a respected pastor. He reminded her how easily stories could be reshaped. Rachel felt the threat settle quietly between them. She reached into her pocket, fingers brushing her phone, the recording already running. She asked him to repeat what he meant. Elias sighed, voice dropping. He said obedience was protection. He said silence was mercy. He said God punished rebellion harshly, especially when it endangered his servants. Rachel's hands shook, but she kept him talking. She asked whether his wife knew. Elias's expression hardened. He said Margaret would be destroyed by truth, and Rachel would be responsible. He said mothers who harmed their children deserved judgment. The words cut deeper than any raised voice. When Rachel stood to leave, Elias blocked the door. He lowered his tone, almost kind. He said accidents happened when people acted irrationally. He said the world was unforgiving to women like her. He suggested prayer could keep everyone safe if she listened. Rachel slipped past him and ran into the night, breath burning, rain soaking her coat. She did not stop until she reached her car. Inside, she played back the recording, tears blurring the screen as his calm threats filled the small space. She called a friend, voice breaking, and told her everything in fragments. She said if anything happened to her, the pastor was responsible. She said she was scared. The friend promised to keep the message, to tell someone if Rachel went silent. At home, Rachel packed a small bag and hid it under the bed. She copied the recording and saved it twice. She slept in her clothes, phone clutched in her hand, listening for every sound. Faith had abandoned her, but instinct had not. Across town, Margaret watched Elias scrub his hands at the sink long after dinner. When she asked what was wrong, he said prayer exhausted him lately. Margaret noticed a faint scratch on his wrist, fresh and red. He covered it quickly. That night, Rachel texted Elias once, asking to meet and talk calmly. She wanted answers, closure, safety. Elias replied minutes later. He said tomorrow night at the church after evening prayer. Rachel stared at the message, knowing she should refuse. Instead, she typed OK. Outside her window, a car engine idled briefly, then drove away. She checked the locks twice and pulled the curtains tight, heart racing with every passing headlight. The recording felt heavier now, like proof and danger combined. She emailed a copy to herself, then to the friend again, labeling it plainly, just in case fear made her forget. Lying back, she whispered a promise to survive the night. Somewhere else, Elias stood alone in the sanctuary, lights off, rehearsing apologies and alibis as easily as sermons. He deleted messages, washed his hands again, and knelt to pray for obedience, not mercy. When he rose, his face was resolved. Tomorrow would end the problem. By dawn, Rachel's phone would ring unanswered, and Grace Hollow would wake believing nothing had changed at all. The meeting time glowed on her screen, unavoidable, as thunder rolled distantly, and she sensed that walking back into the church tomorrow might be the last decision she ever made before silence swallowed her voice completely forever. The storm broke just before Rachel reached the church. Rain fell hard, erasing footprints the moment they touched the ground. The building stood dark except for a single light glowing near the office wing. It felt less like a sanctuary now and more like a place waiting to swallow sound. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and silence. Elias was already there. He greeted her calmly, as if nothing had changed since their last meeting, as if threats had never been spoken. Rachel kept her phone hidden in her pocket, recording again, her pulse pounding louder than the rain on stained glass. They sat across from each other. Elias spoke first, apologizing in soft tones. He said he had prayed all night. He said God demanded resolution. When Rachel mentioned the recording, his face tightened, just slightly. He warned her again about consequences, about how truth without power was just noise no one believed. The conversation shifted quickly. Elias stood, pacing, voice lowering. He said fear made people reckless. He said she was endangering herself and the child by refusing guidance. Rachel felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was no longer about persuasion. It was about control. She stood to leave. That was when the lights went out. For a moment, there was only darkness and the sound of rain. When the emergency lights flickered on, Elias was closer than before. Rachel stepped back, heart racing. She shouted his name, her voice echoing uselessly down empty halls. What happened next was later pieced together in fragments. A neighbor reported hearing a scream swallowed by thunder. A motion sensor activated near the basement stairwell. The church security camera glitched for 7 minutes, recording nothing but static. By morning, Rachel Collins did not answer her phone. Her friend tried calling, then texting, then drove by her apartment. The lights were off. Her car was gone. The bag under her bed remained untouched. Fear spread quickly, quiet but sharp. At the church, Elias told anyone who asked that Rachel had decided to leave town. He said she needed distance, healing. His voice carried sympathy, not urgency. Most believed him. Some nodded sadly. A few noticed his hands tremble slightly during prayer. Margaret noticed more than that. She watched Elias scrub his shoes clean in the sink before service, rainwater and something darker swirling down the drain. When she asked where he'd been so late, he said the church needed him. She said nothing, but the silence between them thickened. By evening, police were notified. Rachel's phone was found near the river, screen cracked but intact. No body, no witnesses willing to speak. The officer called it a possible runaway, citing stress, pregnancy, shame. Elias nodded solemnly when told, offering prayers instead of details. That night, Margaret searched the house while Elias slept. In his coat pocket, she found a key she didn't recognize. Basement storage, stamped faintly on the metal. Her hands shook as understanding crept closer than denial could outrun. Across town, Rachel's friend opened her email again, staring at the attachment labeled plainly. She listened to the recording twice. Then a third time, dread tightening with every word, the calm voice, the veiled threats, the certainty. She called the police back and asked them to listen. As darkness settled over Grace Hollow again, officers returned to the church, flashlights cutting through shadowed hallways. Somewhere beneath the sanctuary, a door creaked open, releasing a smell no prayer could cover, and the silence Elias had relied on finally began to speak. The recording had been quiet until the morning police finally listened. Rachel's voice filled the room, soft at first, trembling, then resolute. Every word she had whispered, every confession, every fearful plea, carried the weight of someone trapped and desperate. Elias's voice was there too, calm, calculated, his threats carefully disguised as concern. The officers exchanged uneasy glances as they realized the gravity of what they had. Margaret sat silently in the corner, listening to the tape again and again. Her hands gripped the edge of the chair until her knuckles turned white. Every line of dialogue revealed what she had long suspected, but had never been able to name. Her husband's authority was a mask, his prayers a weapon, and now, in Rachel's words, the truth spoke louder than any sermon. Outside the precinct, the town remained oblivious. Grace Hollow went about its Sunday rituals unaware that its most trusted shepherd had been manipulating, controlling, and threatening one of its own. The words on the recording painted a picture of deceit so meticulously constructed it almost felt unreal. But the trembling, measured voice of Rachel left no doubt this was real. Every syllable was a cry for help, now echoing from beyond her disappearance. Detectives pieced together the timeline, each fragment of Rachel's life pulled from texts, phone logs, and witness statements. Every late-night meeting, every unrecorded counseling session suddenly became evidence. The church walls, once comforting, now loomed as silent witnesses. Margaret realized she had been seeing the signs all along: suspicious departures, evasive answers, strange messages, but had ignored them, trusting the man she married and the facade of holiness. The audio revealed more than threats. It revealed Elias's psychology, the calmness in his voice, the careful phrasing, the mixture of scripture and intimidation. It was manipulation dressed as divine instruction. Rachel's fear, her tears, her quiet resistance, all contrasted with the calculated authority in his tone. The room was heavy with the realization that spiritual power had been weaponized. When officers reviewed the messages, they discovered subtle hints of Elias's plan. He had predicted Rachel's actions, expected her hesitation, and accounted for every possible reaction. His control extended beyond the office, beyond the church, into the very way she thought and felt. Each word on the recording revealed a man who had cloaked obsession in faith, dominance in mercy. Margaret felt bile rise as she replayed a passage where Elias told Rachel she must comply to protect everyone else. She shivered, recognizing the pattern. Emotional manipulation, psychological imprisonment, threats veiled as divine instruction. The pastor she knew, the man she had loved, was capable of far more than anyone could have imagined. Somewhere in the police station, Rachel's phone buzzed again. It was a message that had gone unnoticed earlier. "He knows where I am." The recording ended just before that line, leaving a hollow silence that echoed like a warning. It was the last evidence of her voice before the night she disappeared. Margaret stared at the speakerphone, tears blurring her vision. Her husband had lied, deceived, controlled, and hidden a darkness that now threatened to consume everything. She realized with horror that the investigation was only beginning, that the full truth of Rachel's disappearance and Elias's crimes was still buried in shadows. Detectives decided to recheck the church basement and office spaces with renewed urgency. Every corner could hide evidence. Every lock, every closet, every forgotten key became a possible clue. And somewhere in the quiet halls of Grace Hollow, voices from the past, the frightened whispers, the hidden cries, seemed to echo again, guiding investigators toward truths the town had been blind to, and toward a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. The pastor's carefully built world, so reliant on silence, was beginning to crumble, and as officers prepared to step into the shadows he had commanded for so long, Margaret understood. What they would find might change everything forever. The news of Rachel's disappearance had spread through Grace Hollow like wildfire, but most still clung to the story Elias carefully told. She had left town, seeking peace and healing. No one questioned him. No one wanted to. Faith demanded trust, and Elias had built decades of it brick by brick, sermon by sermon. But now, with the recording in the hands of the police, that trust began to crack. Detectives arrived at the church early one morning, their presence quiet but firm. Elias opened the doors with a practiced smile. Inside, the sanctuary felt impossibly silent, as if even the stained glass held its breath. Officers immediately asked for him to come to the station for questioning. Elias hesitated, glanced toward Margaret, then nodded. Calm, composed, faithful, at least outwardly. At the station, the interrogation room smelled faintly of bleach. The harsh fluorescent lights reflected off the table, and Elias sat upright, fingers interlaced. Detectives played the audio. Rachel's voice filled the room, trembling and pleading, a stark contrast to the serene authority he projected in the pulpit. His jaw tightened with each line, though he spoke nothing at first. Silence had always been his weapon. Now it offered no protection. Where is she? One detective finally asked. Elias's lips pressed into a thin line. He claimed ignorance, that Rachel had made her choices freely, that he had counseled her as any man of God would. But every answer was careful, rehearsed, too precise. Detectives noticed the small cracks, a hesitation, a quick swallow, a flicker of fear in his eyes. Margaret arrived at the station, having followed instinct rather than instruction. She stood just outside the glass partition, watching the man she had loved crumble in ways she had never imagined. He was still eloquent, still using scripture to defend himself, but the voice that once inspired entire congregations now sounded hollow. The mask was slipping. When detectives confronted him with evidence of his manipulations, the subtle threats, the planning revealed in Rachel's messages, Elias began to falter. His hands shook slightly. His eyes darted. For the first time in decades, he could not control the narrative, could not control the fear he had instilled in others. Words that once commanded obedience now faltered, awkward and fragile. Margaret stepped closer. She asked questions, voice firm but trembling. What did you do to her? How could you risk everything for this? Elias looked at her, and for the first time there was no sermon, no mask, no authority. Only raw panic, thinly veiled by prayer. I only wanted to protect her, he whispered, but it was too late. His wife's gaze did not soften. Detectives pressed on, and the cracks widened. Traces of blood in the church basement, unexplained gaps in security footage, and Rachel's abandoned phone began to paint a picture Elias could no longer deny. He stumbled over answers, tried to redirect blame, even invoked God's will. But every word dug him deeper. Outside the station, reporters had begun to gather. Grace Hollow murmured in confusion and disbelief. The man who had delivered sermons on morality and temptation, who had guided hundreds of souls, now sat exposed as a man who manipulated, threatened, and possibly harmed one of his own flock. Margaret felt bile rise as she realized the truth. The life they had built on faith and authority was collapsing, and the man she had married was at the center of it all. As Elias was led back to a holding room, he caught a glimpse of Rachel's recording still playing on a computer screen. Her voice seemed to mock him, calm but unwavering. "He knows where I am." His calm facade cracked fully, leaving only panic, guilt, and fear in its place. He slumped forward, whispering prayers that would never answer him now. Margaret stood silently, realizing the enormity of what she had witnessed. She knew the next steps could not be stopped. Justice was inevitable, and the world would finally see what she had suspected all along. Spiritual authority, when misused, could destroy lives. And tonight, Elias Moore's carefully controlled empire of faith, fear, and silence had begun its final unraveling. The basement beneath Grace Hollow had always been ignored, a place for storage and forgotten church supplies. The faint smell of mildew lingered, unnoticed behind the scent of incense and polished wood above. But now, with detectives working methodically, the hidden spaces were no longer invisible. Every corner, every crack in the floorboards became a possible clue. Margaret watched from the stairwell, her stomach tightening as the officers moved cautiously, flashlights cutting through shadows. She had followed every instinct she had been ignoring for weeks. She had prayed silently that what she feared most was not true, but intuition, sharp and relentless, left no room for hope. Then came the moment that would forever shatter Grace Hollow. Detective Harris knelt near the altar foundation, flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. The beam fell on the edge of a panel that didn't match the others, slightly raised as though hiding something beneath. With careful precision, he pried it open. Dust swirled into the air. Beneath the panel, wrapped loosely in a thin blanket, lay Rachel Collins. Her eyes were closed, her body pale, the small curve of her stomach visible beneath the cloth. Margaret gasped, hand flying to her mouth. The past weeks, the messages, the recordings, the strange absences, all collapsed into this single horrifying moment. She forced herself to stay back, unable to look away, even as nausea gripped her. Detectives worked quickly, confirming what everyone feared. Rachel was dead. The unborn child had not survived. Evidence of trauma was subtle but clear. She had been silenced, hidden. The sanctuary above had stood as a monument to faith, while beneath it, the consequences of betrayal and abuse festered in darkness. The room smelled of damp earth and old wood, a stark contrast to the familiar fragrance of prayer candles upstairs. Margaret shivered, realizing the weight of silence that had allowed this to happen. Every word Elias had spoken, every manipulation disguised as care, every veiled threat, none of it had been idle. He had built a perfect facade, and behind it, destroyed life and innocence. Outside, sirens cut through the night, drawing attention from the few remaining townspeople. They would soon hear whispers, rumors, and then the full truth. For now, though, the church remained eerily quiet, as if mourning its own failure. Elias was arrested on the spot. Calm earlier in the evening, he now appeared small and exposed, shuffling in handcuffs, muttering prayers under his breath. The congregation that had once followed his every word now watched from a distance, disbelief etched across their faces. Some shook their heads, others wept silently. Margaret remained behind the police tape, silent but resolute, knowing this was only the beginning. The investigation quickly uncovered more than anyone expected. Hidden messages, deleted emails, and financial records painted a picture of premeditation. Elias had orchestrated Rachel's meetings, controlled her movements, and, when she resisted, removed her completely from the world above ground. Grace Hollow had been his stage, and everyone had played a part in the silence. Margaret walked slowly to the altar, her eyes tracing the polished wood, the cross, the stained glass reflecting moonlight. The church, a place meant to offer solace and guidance, had become a tomb of secrets. She placed her hand lightly on the surface, feeling the weight of truth pressing down. Detectives spoke softly among themselves, planning the next steps. Evidence collection, autopsy reports, charges, each procedure formalized the horror into concrete terms. The town would eventually know, but tonight was reserved for the private reckoning, the moment when faith, authority, and manipulation collided with justice. Somewhere nearby, the recording of Rachel's voice echoed in Margaret's mind. "He knows where I am." That line, whispered in fear weeks before, now carried the bitter clarity of inevitability. As the night deepened, Margaret realized that the final confrontation had only just begun. Elias Moore was behind bars, but the moral collapse, the betrayal of trust, and the haunting silence he had cultivated would ripple through Grace Hollow for years. The church remained, sacred yet tainted, its walls holding both the memory of a young woman lost and the grim reminder that even the holiest places could hide the darkest sins. Margaret exhaled slowly, bracing herself. The world above would awaken soon. The truth would spread, and no one would ever hear Rachel's voice again except in whispers, recordings, and the memory of a life stolen beneath the altar. The pastor's reign was over, but the echoes of his crimes had only just begun to speak. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood, coffee, and tension. Reporters jostled for position, cameras ready, microphones tilted toward the defendant. Inside, Elias Moore sat rigid, hands cuffed, his face pale but carefully composed. The man who had once commanded devotion from hundreds now appeared small under the harsh lights, stripped of authority, his every word dissected. Margaret Moore sat in the front row, flanked by family and close friends, her eyes red from sleepless nights. She had watched the unraveling of her husband's carefully curated world, and now she watched the law take its course. The judge entered, and silence descended like a heavy curtain. The trial opened with the prosecution presenting Rachel Collins' recording, the same audio that had unveiled manipulation, threats, and premeditation. The room went still as her trembling, pleading voice filled the courtroom. Every listener felt the weight of her fear, every syllable exposing a cruel dynamic of trust exploited and authority misused. Detectives recounted the evidence. Abandoned phone, the blood traces, the hidden keys, the altered church schedules, and the inconsistencies in Elias's alibis. Each piece built a tapestry of calculated control and deliberate concealment. Margaret's stomach tightened as details of Rachel's disappearance were read aloud. The plan, coercion, the isolation, the ultimate silencing beneath the altar she had walked past countless times. Witnesses were called. Friends of Rachel testified about her fear, her growing anxiety, the confessions she had shared in hushed voices before vanishing. Church members, some tearful, recounted the pastor's charisma, his control over the congregation, and the subtle intimidation that kept even adults hesitant to question him. One elderly parishioner admitted that even in moments of doubt, Elias had spoken with such authority that fear outweighed suspicion. Margaret was asked to take the stand. She spoke slowly, measured, recounting years of subtle changes, late nights, hidden phones, cryptic messages, and the growing distance in their marriage. She described how she had started noticing anomalies only when Rachel disappeared, the scarf, the scratches, the second phone. Her testimony carried the weight of both betrayal and revelation, and the courtroom listened in stunned silence. Elias's defense tried to frame everything as guidance gone awry, a series of misunderstandings, a moral lapse rather than criminal intent. They argued that Rachel had made choices freely and that any resulting tragedy was an unfortunate accident, not premeditated. But the evidence, recordings, and testimonies painted a much darker reality. Each attempt to rationalize his actions crumbled under the scrutiny of facts and witness recollections. Psychologists testified, explaining the manipulation tactics used, how authority had been weaponized, and how Rachel's compliance had been coerced through fear disguised as spiritual counsel. They described the psychological toll on victims and the subtle, insidious ways a person in power can exploit trust. Every word reinforced the narrative that Elias's holiness had been a cover for obsession, cruelty, and destruction. The courtroom grew heavy with the emotional weight of the story. Tears were shed by some, anger flared in others, and murmurs rippled as Elias's facade of faith and trust disintegrated before everyone present. Rachel's absence was palpable. Her voice, through the recording, became the most powerful presence in the room, a haunting testament that even death could not silence truth. After hours of testimony, the final statements were made. The prosecution outlined the deliberate nature of the crimes, the abuse of spiritual authority, the planning, and the moral responsibility Elias bore. The defense faltered, unable to explain away the meticulous evidence of intent and control. Margaret, sitting quietly, felt both grief and relief. Justice was moving forward, even if Rachel could not return. When the jury retired, the room felt suspended in time. Everyone present understood the gravity of what had transpired: trust shattered, a life stolen, and a community forced to confront its blind faith. Hours passed, the tension thick, before the jury returned. Elias Moore was found guilty on all counts: manipulation, coercion, and murder. The sentence reflected the severity of his betrayal and the lives destroyed under his authority. Margaret exhaled slowly, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She had lived with fear and doubt, watched the man she had married disintegrate, and now she felt the bitter relief of truth validated. She knew, though, that judgment extended beyond the courtroom. Grace Hollow itself had to confront the culture that allowed blind devotion to mask evil. Outside, cameras flashed as Elias was led away. He offered no explanation, no confession, only a faint muttering of prayers meant to convince himself of innocence. Margaret stayed back, watching him go, thinking of Rachel, thinking of the silence beneath the altar, and realizing that healing would take longer than a verdict could offer. Yet there was a strange clarity now. Justice had been served, voices had been heard, and the town, however reluctantly, had been forced to see what they had ignored. Faith, when misused, could destroy lives, but accountability, when demanded, could finally bring light to the darkest corners. Margaret walked away from the courthouse, shoulders heavy but resolute. She carried grief, yes, but also the understanding that truth, no matter how long buried, always finds its way. And somewhere in the quiet spaces of the church, Rachel's presence lingered, not lost, but a reminder of courage, resilience, and the cost of silence. The pastor's reign was ended, the victim remembered, and Grace Hollow, though scarred, had begun the slow process of confronting what true justice demanded. And as Margaret stepped into the crisp night air, she realized judgment had come for everyone, not only the guilty, but also the bystanders, the enablers, and the faithful who had looked away. The echoes of truth would not fade, and neither would the lessons learned from the life stolen beneath the altar.